Eric Clapton was sitting on the second stool in Studio 2 at Abbey Road when George Harrison walked through the door. The session engineer had let Eric Clapton in 20 minutes early, a warm-up before the tape rolled. And in those 20 minutes, Eric Clapton had been playing something that wasn't on any chart and wasn't scheduled for any session, something Eric Clapton had been carrying around for a few weeks and hadn't yet decided what to do with. The engineer had been listening from behind the glass and had not said anything, because there are pieces of music that announce themselves as complete before anyone has finished writing them, and this was one of those. Then the door opened. George Harrison came in. George Harrison heard 4 bars, and George Harrison put down everything he was carrying and walked directly to the first stool without saying a word to anyone. Before we get into what happened in that room, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from right now, and hit subscribe if you're new. This story is worth every minute. October 1969. Studio 2 at Abbey Road, St. John's Wood, London. Eric Clapton had been inside these walls before. The studio was not unfamiliar, but that Tuesday morning, Eric Clapton was there early, alone, with nothing scheduled and a melody that needed somewhere to go. The session engineer was a man named David Hollis, 31 years old, 8 years at Abbey Road, a white lab coat over a white shirt, the way every engineer in that building dressed in those years. David Hollis had worked sessions with most of the significant names that had passed through Abbey Road in 8 years. David Hollis had learned to tell within the first minute whether what was about to happen in the recording room was ordinary or not. Studio 2 was the largest of the 3 recording rooms at Abbey Road, a high-ceiling space with a parquet wood floor, acoustic panels mounted on the walls, and several movable baffles that could be positioned to shape the sound depending on what was being recorded. When the room held a full orchestra, it was one kind of place. When the room held one person on a stool with one guitar, the high ceiling and the wooden floor and the acoustic panels did something else. They kept the sound present and close, made the space feel more intimate than its dimensions suggested. This was the room where some of the most significant recordings in modern music had been made. On a Tuesday morning in October with no tape rolling, it was simply a large room with good acoustics and one man who had something to say. Eric Clapton had arrived at 8:45 and taken the second stool, positioned slightly closer to the control room window, which was where Eric Clapton preferred to sit when working in a room with a glass panel. Eric Clapton plugged into the small practice amp at the side of the room, not the main recording setup, but the amp that was always there for warm-ups, and began to play. Not the piece, not yet. Just the edges of it, testing whether the room was going to cooperate. The room cooperated immediately. What Eric Clapton was playing was not a song in the conventional sense. It had a melody, a clear, sustained melodic line moving through a key that sat somewhere between blues and something Eric Clapton didn't have a name for. It had the outline of a structure, the way a piece has structure, before the songwriter has fully committed to what the structure is. What it didn't have was an ending. Eric Clapton hadn't found the ending, and the reason Eric Clapton hadn't found the ending was that the piece seemed to resist resolution. Every time Eric Clapton moved toward a conclusion, the melody pulled back, returned to the same suspended figure in the middle register, and waited. It was the kind of piece that knows what it is before the person playing it does. David Hollis had been watching from the control room since approximately the 3rd minute. David Hollis had not moved from the glass panel. David Hollis had meant to position the microphones, check the levels, prepare the track sheets for what had been scheduled for 9 o'clock. None of that had happened. David Hollis was standing at the glass with both hands in the pockets of the white lab coat, watching Eric Clapton's left hand on the neck of the guitar, and listening to something that was not warm-up and was not rehearsal. 18 minutes passed this way. Then David Hollis heard the door to the studio corridor open from outside. George Harrison had arrived at Abbey Road at 9 o'clock, which was on time, which was the way George Harrison preferred to arrive at sessions when the session mattered. George Harrison was 26 years old that October, and in the preceding 12 months, George Harrison had written more music than in any previous year of George Harrison's career, music that was accumulating in notebooks and on cassette tapes and in the margins of score sheets. Music that felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely George Harrison's own. rather than something being fitted into spaces other people had defined. George Harrison had things to record. George Harrison was here to record them. George Harrison came through the main entrance of Abbey Road, turned left down the corridor that led to Studio 2, and stopped. The sound was coming through the corridor wall, not loudly, just present, a guitar through a small amp in a large room, and the specific quality of the melody carrying through the door at the end of the corridor. George Harrison stood in the corridor and listened. The melody moved through its suspended figure, the same one, the unresolved one, the one that kept returning to the same place in the middle register and waiting. George Harrison stood in the corridor for approximately 45 seconds. Then George Harrison walked to the door of Studio 2, put a hand on the handle, and opened it. The door opened and the melody arrived at full volume. 4 bars. That was how long it took. George Harrison stood in the doorway of Studio 2 with a guitar case in one hand and a canvas bag in the other, and in 4 bars, George Harrison understood several things simultaneously. What the piece was, what it wanted to be, and why Eric Clapton had not yet been able to finish it. The piece was waiting for a second voice. It had been waiting since before Eric Clapton arrived at the studio that morning. The unresolved figure in the middle register was not a compositional problem. It was an invitation. George Harrison set the canvas bag down beside the door without looking at it. George Harrison set the guitar case down beside the canvas bag without looking at it. David Hollis, watching from behind the glass in the control room, did not move. Eric Clapton, on the second stool, had not looked up, was still inside the piece, still working through the suspended figure, still looking for the resolution that was now, though Eric Clapton did not yet know this, standing in the doorway of Studio 2, holding a guitar case. George Harrison walked across the parquet floor without saying a word to anyone, reached the first stool, sat down, and opened the studio's house guitar case that was already waiting there. A sunburst Les Paul that had been used in this room many times before. Then George Harrison began to play. What George Harrison played in response to Eric Clapton's melody was not an answer. It was something more specific than an answer, a parallel line that acknowledged the suspension without resolving it, the way a second voice in a conversation doesn't solve what the first voice says, but confirms that the first voice has been genuinely heard. 2 guitars. 2 musicians who had, separately and over years, developed an understanding of what music is and what it asks of the people making it. Now occupying the same room and finding, within the first 30 seconds of playing together, that they were speaking the same language. The first thing Eric Clapton noticed was that George Harrison did not try to lead. Most guitarists, in the presence of an unfinished piece being played by another guitarist, will move toward it, will reach for the obvious complement, the expected harmony, the interval that makes the most conventional sense. George Harrison did none of this. George Harrison listened to where Eric Clapton's melody was going and found the place just beside it, the place that made the space around the melody more visible rather than filling it in. This was not a small thing. This was the kind of playing that requires a person to be genuinely more interested in the music than in their own contribution to it. Eric Clapton had encountered this quality in very few people. Hearing it arrive on a Tuesday morning in Studio 2, unexpected, through 4 bars heard through a studio door, was the kind of thing that stays. David Hollis watched from behind the glass for approximately 90 seconds. Then David Hollis turned to the recording console and began to roll tape. David Hollis did this without saying anything to either musician, without announcing it, without asking permission. David Hollis made the kind of professional judgment that 8 years in rooms like this one produces, that what was happening on the other side of the glass was something that should not be allowed to pass without a record. The tape rolled. Neither Eric Clapton nor George Harrison noticed. Both musicians were inside the music, the specific interior state that certain kinds of playing produce, where the awareness of the room and the engineer and the equipment recedes, and the only things present are the sound and the other person making sound. This state cannot be manufactured or scheduled. It arrives when it arrives, and the only thing that accelerates its arrival is 2 people who understand the same language encountering each other in the same room with instruments in their hands. This was one of those mornings. Leave a comment below with the Eric Clapton and George Harrison moment that has stayed with you longest, and subscribe now if you haven't already. These are the stories that don't make the documentaries, and we tell one every week. The piece found its ending in the second hour. In the first hour, Eric Clapton and George Harrison moved through the melody in various configurations, one leading, then the other, then both simultaneously, and at one point neither of them leading at all, but both of them simply playing alongside the piece the way you walk alongside a river rather than trying to direct where the river goes. The suspended figure kept returning throughout all of it, kept arriving at the same place in the middle register and waiting. Neither musician forced it. Neither musician tried to shortcut past it. They let it return as many times as it needed to return, which turned out to be the right approach because the piece had been returning to that figure for a reason that neither musician had yet identified. Then, in the second hour, George Harrison took the melody and adjusted it by a single note in the middle register, a change so small that it should not have mattered and changed everything. The resolution that had been refusing to arrive was suddenly present, obvious, inevitable, the only possible place the melody could land. Eric Clapton heard it arrive in real time, mid-phrase, and stopped playing for one beat of silence. Then Eric Clapton came back in, and the piece moved through its final bars and resolved completely for the first time since Eric Clapton had found it. They played it through twice, beginning to end, with the resolution in place. Then they sat in silence for a moment, the way musicians sit in silence after something has gone exactly where it needed to go. Then George Harrison said something. Eric Clapton answered. Then they played something else entirely, a different piece, George Harrison's, one that arrived in the room now because the morning had produced the conditions for it to arrive. The session that had been scheduled for 9 o'clock began at 11:15. 2 hours and 15 minutes late because two musicians had spent 2 hours and 15 minutes playing something that had not been scheduled, had not been on any chart or track sheet, and had not been planned by anyone. The other musicians who arrived for the session found Eric Clapton and George Harrison sitting on two stools in Studio 2 in the specific quiet that follows music that has gone somewhere real. Nobody asked what had happened. The room communicated it. David Hollis kept the tapes. Not all of them were used. Some of what had been recorded that morning was not a finished piece, but a conversation, and conversations are not always for release. What David Hollis knew, sitting at the console afterward, was that the 2 hours of tape from that morning contained something the scheduled session would not contain. The sound of two people finding a piece of music together in real time, neither of them leading, both of them listening. The piece arriving between them rather than from either of them alone. George Harrison would speak about Eric Clapton in interviews over the years, with the quietness and specificity that George Harrison brought to the things that had genuinely mattered. George Harrison said once that Eric Clapton was the most unselfish guitarist George Harrison had ever played with. That Eric Clapton always knew where to go, and always went somewhere that made what was already happening better rather than bigger. George Harrison said this in the context of the guitar, but the people who heard it understood that George Harrison was describing something larger than technique. George Harrison was describing a quality of attention, the capacity to be inside the music, and also, simultaneously, inside the music, another person is making, following where the other person goes without knowing in advance where that will be, staying present to the direction rather than anticipating it. This is rarer than talent. This is rarer than technique. It cannot be taught in any room except the room where two musicians are playing together and one of them chooses, in real time, to listen rather than lead. This is what was in Studio 2 at Abbey Road on a Tuesday morning in October 1969, from 8:45 until 11:15, with the tape rolling from the 90th second onward and neither musician knowing it. Eric Clapton did not speak about that morning in interviews. What Eric Clapton did in the years that followed was continue to make music with the quality of attention that George Harrison had described, interested in what the music needs rather than what the musician can demonstrate, always more focused on where the piece is going than on the impression the player is making along the way. George Harrison died in November 2001 at 58 years old after a long illness that George Harrison navigated with the same quietness George Harrison brought to everything that mattered. Eric Clapton spoke about George Harrison afterward carefully, briefly, and with the particular weight that people bring to losses they do not intend to reduce by talking about too much. What the two of them built together beginning on a Tuesday morning in a large room with good acoustics and a tape that started rolling when neither of them was watching. Chi belongs to the record. The record is still there. Subscribe. Leave a comment with the Eric Clapton and George Harrison song that reached you first. The recording, the collaboration, the specific moment you understood what those two guitars could do together. And come back next week, because there are more of these stories, and every one of them is worth the wait.